Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. Today, we've got a real treat for you, all the way from Colorado. Is it Boulder, if I remember rightly?
Yeah. Yes, it is Boulder.
Boulder. I had somebody on the show from Boulder a few weeks ago, and we had this really weird conversation about Mork and Mindy. Do you remember Mork and Mindy?
Yes, and I know exactly the house that they showed on the opening of Mork and Mindy.
So it's a hotbed of adoption experts is Boulder. You're an adopted mum to two kids from Russia, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Yes, that is correct.
And Heather Forbes, welcome to the show. She's an adopted mother, and she's also an expert speaker. Does a lot of work in schools, a lot of work with families as well. So you're in for a real treat. Hello.
Hi. Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So as I was saying before we kicked off, I was thinking about how we start the conversation, and the strapline that you've got, I absolutely love it, and it's love always prevails. So why did you pick that as a strapline?
I think that comes from my own personal experience, because when you are parenting a child that is really showing the signs of what trauma does to them from their heart, from their perspective, from even their physiology, it can get really, really tough on those days where you feel like you just want to throw in the towel. And I had those days. And I think you have to always understand that love will prevail. You will come out of this. We may not know how we're going to get there. We may not know the journey and the details, but to trust the process. And that's one thing I've also done professionally when working with parents and professionals, is to say, listen, we just trust the process. This is not a linear path. It's not like, okay, you're better today, and then we get a little bit better tomorrow, and then all of a sudden we all live happily ever after. It is definitely a roller coaster ride. This is a developmental journey of finding healing. And I think that's the other word that we have to really look at, is that this is not about changing kids' behaviors. This is about helping them heal. And so that is a lifelong process. And that is why then I always like to say that love prevails. And I'll say this, I'll add to that. I used to say love never fails. And that to me is still negative, because there's a never in that. So I have switched it around recently to say that love always prevails.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. So there's, I talk about being trauma informed and hope obsessed.
Yes, exactly.
And what I have some slight concerns about if we don't have the positive side to it, because for me it can become, it gets darker.
Yes, it does.
What we focus on gets bigger.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it is all about that hope. So I love the positive notion of that. And people come to me and they say, well, you've got a very positive view on this, Simon. And I say, well, yeah, I do. I do, because I truly believe that what we focus on gets bigger. That doesn't mean that I don't have my moments. There's something's occurring to me really about, well, that sounds like I'm some sort of spiritual medium, some voices coming down from the earth. It's not like that. There's, on one hand, we've got this kind of love always prevails philosophy, and then when we get into it's emotional, it's feeling driven, it's our love of our kids. And on the other side, we've got this kind of like the hard brain science stuff. So how do those two, they seem to me to be, maybe because I don't know my stuff like you do, there seems to be a little bit of a clash there in my head to this stuff. So could you bring your experience to bear to kind of put those two things together?
That's a great perspective. I don't think I've ever thought about it from those two and how they relate or don't relate. I actually think that when you do get more on the emotional side, let's say you're going down into that dark place and things don't feel like they're going to get better. And because it feels some days that you just don't know what's going to happen next, and what happens next isn't feeling like a good thing. But sometimes then you have to switch over and to be more of the logical one. And I think that's where the science does come in, because we know from science that trauma impacts the brain severely at many different levels. And the children that are impacted by trauma, that they are operating from a very different part of their brain. Literally, the blood flow is down in what we call the midbrain, which is the fear receptor. And so everything that they see, everything that they perceive, everything that they experience, we now know that there is a scientific basis for that, that they are seeing it from a very strong fear-based perspective. And knowing that, it kind of makes sense then why your child is doing what they're doing, or why this behavior is coming out this way. It starts to actually make sense. Even if you feel like you're living in crazy town, there is this sort of rational thinking that, oh, okay, that's why. They're not just being maliciously evil, and they're not just after me, and they're not just making my life miserable, which sometimes it can feel that way. And so it is a matter of then switching over to more of that logical inside. Okay, it is this bad, and there's a reason it's this bad, but also then the hope. And I love that, being obsessive about hope, because we also know from the brain science that the brain is malleable, especially for our young kids and even our teenagers, that the brain is always evolving, always laying down new neural pathways. And we can make those corrections in the brain so that to get them out of that fear receptor, to help calm them down, to help them to be able to find the trust and the certainty that they are just craving. But it does take a journey of experience, and there's no magic purple pill to that. But I do always want to hold on to the science, because the science gives us hope as well. So I like to use the two. And in fact, when I'm working with parents or professionals or anyone that they don't see that these behaviors are driven by trauma, and they just see them as bad behaviors, and then, the child just needs to make a better choice, and all these old traditional dialogues that we have around behavior, I do tend to lean on the science and say, okay, yes, but look at the science. This is what the science is holding out for us. This is the reasoning. This is the perspective that we can hold, that this is not a quote bad child, that there is a reason for this. So I love sort of using science as a fallback, because I think it can pick us up in those dark days.
Yeah. Have you read the Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey book?
I have not read it yet. Okay. It's on my list.
So, which question do I ask that next then? I don't. Let me go to a different question. So let me explain my take on the book. Right. So it encompasses a lot of what you just said, and it's a long book, and every now and again, every now and again, Bruce Perry drops a sentence of hope about neuroplasticity, and then they go back to the trauma, and they don't. In my opinion, I kept listening to it, right, because I thought sooner or later they're going to get to the bit about how to help our kids heal, and they never did. They never did. So a huge lost opportunity for me. Yeah. A huge lost opportunity for me. It was all about understanding and nothing about healing, in my opinion. Right. But what do I know compared to Bruce Perry and Oprah? It's just my opinion. Just my opinion, listeners. So how do we harness the brain's neuroplasticity to help our kids heal?
And that's the $1 million question. You hit the nail on the head there, because I believe that that's the piece that has been missing, is the how. You absolutely have to have the understanding. Otherwise, you're not going to make it through. But the how, and that is where I really feel like I have had a passion in my work for the last 20 years to be able to give that how. As a young parent that was trying to understand my family, that my family was collapsing. My kids were in such a just a very challenging place. And I was in a challenging place amongst all of that dynamic. And I kept searching for that. Like you said, Simon, I kept searching for the how. I was like, okay, I can go spend the day in the library and understand the research, understand the all the diagrams and the PET scans and everything. But I went back home and I said, well, now what do I do? And so that's on my, I typically say that's where it's about bridging the gap between the science and when the rubber hits the road. What does that look like? And so, yeah, how does that happen? That's the piece that I love to give to parents and to professionals and to everyone I'm working with. And the how, in a nutshell, I will say this, is that the biggest part of that how is making sure that you as the adult are as regulated as possible, that you keep yourself in a state of love, that you don't get sucked into the vortex of all the dysfunction happening around you, and you don't get sucked into all the pain of your kids, that you have to be there in an open, loving way, but not to fall down to that level. You have to rise above that. And when you rise above that and stay that way, you then continue the course. And the course is that you continue to stay there in relationship. That doesn't mean that if your kid's beating you up, you get beat up. That means you hold strong boundaries and that you have safety as number one in your family, but you hold the boundary that says, I will never give up on you, ever, ever. I will hold the line. We will struggle together. I will join you. Just because I'm joining you doesn't mean I agree with you. I think one of the things we miss is that empathy is not about agreeing with someone. It's about understanding them, understanding that they're struggling, but to hold them and sort of scaffold them up. And I will tell you my own parenting journey that there were times I was like, I'm not sure I can be the scaffolding. I'm the one that's crumbling at this point. And so if anyone goes to therapy, I think the parent goes to therapy. And I say that in a loving way, because you got to get yourself in a place where you can give back again. And our kids, this is the thing, when you raise children that are not impacted by trauma, what we call our neurotypical children, they can give back. So when you say, hey, honey, I love you, like when you go and you tuck them into bed and you say, I love you, guess what comes back? What comes back is, Mom, I love you too. Dad, I love you too. And you leave and you feel great. And there's this nice reciprocity. And so it fills your cup. When you're raising children that have been impacted by trauma, you walk in and you say, honey, I love you. And then nothing comes back. And you have to leave going, that's what unconditional love is. Now I understand that I give to my children. They may not be able to even receive it right now. And they certainly aren't in a place to give back. But I will give and I will give. And so what you have to do as a parent is continually build yourself back up. And what does that look like? Hopefully you have another partner in the home that can fill that. Maybe you have a friend, maybe it's a spiritual experience. I've always said that adoption is a spiritual experience. And so you have to fill yourself up and not relate yourself and let me say this, you cannot identify yourself as either a good parent or a bad parent based off of your child's experience, based off of their behavior. And that's really the piece, I think, that when we talk about healing and the how is taking care of yourself, being in the best space that you can be, and as far as your own growth, and holding the boundaries, holding the line, holding the consistency. Our kids need absolute security as far as the schedule needs to be held. You have to have what's going to happen next does happen next. You have to have repetition. I'm the kind of the person that loves to be just spontaneous. Well, our kids can't handle spontaneity. And so you do have to live your life a little bit more on what is best for your children, knowing that it's not forever. It's just a temporary time and it's what they need. And that's what we signed up for, whether we knew it or not. So that's a nutshell and like the last 20 years of work of answering the how.
Okay. So essentially, and this is a theme that's come out loud and proud in a lot of episodes that we've done. It's about doing our own work.
Yes. And being open to it. And I will tell you personally, when I realized that, I went kicking and screaming. I was like, I didn't sign up for this. Yeah. But I sit here today and I am happier than I've ever been in my life. I have a perspective of the world that's much broader than I ever would have had before, had it not been for my children. So as much as what I gave to them, not thinking I was getting anything back, yes, they gave me back more than I could ever expect. And I am the person I am, the happiness and the joy that I experienced in my life. I will credit them for putting my family through a very dark time, because it made me get to the root of my own issues. That, of course, we think we don't have any issues. We're adults. We're fine. But of course we don't, we all do. And so by putting that requirement into my own self-development was the key to helping my kids.
Yeah. There's a lot of parallels with me as an adopted adult and what I've learned through this stuff. So I'll kind of echo some of that back in a slightly different way in case it lands differently with the listeners. Mm-hmm. So I thought my life was a 9 out of 10. But I realized later it was kind of like a 4 out of 10, because I underestimated the issues, and it wasn't just adoption. It was actually largely business issues. Business was a far bigger stressor of my life than adoption. Far more chronic. So I thought my life was a 9 out of 10. It kind of slumped down. And I realized it's only probably a 4 out of 10. And then it's back like 9.5, like a 9.5 out of 10. Or when I was talking to my mentor the other week, we got to a 12 out of 10. So there you go. That was in that moment. In that moment, it was a 12 out of 10. And sometimes it's a lot lower than that. But the biggest thing that I've learned on this journey is, if we're okay with not being okay, we're always okay. If we are resisting, right? So like you, I resisted at the start of the journey. You used a spiritual word as well. So I resisted at the start of the spiritual journey, and then I let it go, and that's when all the learning happened after that. So we think we're okay, something happens, and we realize that actually our personal growth has been catapulted forward on the back of the learnings that we've had as we've explored ourselves through therapy, coaching, online courses, books, videos, whatever it is. That's how it kind of seems to me.
I agree. Absolutely. And it's, well, go ahead.
Yeah. So let's jump into the spiritual side then. Why did you bring that word up, Heather?
Well, because I think we have to get outside of ourselves, and whatever that understanding that we each have of that source, that God, that energy outside of us, whatever you want to call that, and everyone's going to have their own name for that. It's bigger than we are, and thank goodness for that. That you have to recognize that you're just a part of this journey, and that you can't fix everything on your own, and you have to be able to, like you said, sort of give into that, knowing that, all right, well, I'm not all right, but somehow, some way, I'm going to find my way. And I just, I don't want to dive deep into my own spiritual piece. I think it's a very personal process for everybody. But I think that in general, it is widening our perspective of who we are and broadening our perspective of why children are, struggling. And we always, and I know you have such a different perspective, and I value that, because I'm not adopted, but I'm an adoptive mom. So I have that perspective. I have a perspective as a professional in adoption field. And so bringing all these perspectives together is so important. And they talk about the triangle of adoption, but it's bigger than that even. It's just, we all have our perception, and to make sure that we're not getting narrow, that the blinders are not on. I guess that's the biggest thing, is that we're opening up to, I had to open up to my child's perspective. And I couldn't expect them to open them up to my perspective until they're adults. But I had to be in their shoes. I had to be and walk their walk. I had to see life from their perspective. And to me, that's a spiritual experience, because you were extending yourself into someone else's world.
Yeah. So how do you help parents see that for themselves? Because there's theory and there's theory in this practice, isn't there? And in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. And practice, there's lots of things. And I came up with something a few years ago, a line that I came up with in the moment, which I'm quite proud of. And it's there's no such thing as a second-hand insight. So we have to have them for ourselves. And you could use the word perspective as well. So there's no such thing as a second-hand shift in perspective. We have to have them for ourselves. There's no such thing as a spiritual insight, like second-hand one. We have to have them for ourselves. There's no such thing as a second-hand epiphany if you're in you want to go for a religious thing. So we can't. This podcast is all about bringing those different perspectives that you're talking about. And the idea is to explore those different perspectives to catalyze a perspective shift in the listener. That's what I'm trying to do. But I can't force that. I can't force that to happen, because there's no such thing as a second insight.
Right.
So how do you get parents? How do you, and you can't put a gun to the head and say, parent, have an insight, right? That's not going to work. Sorry. How do you encourage insights in parents about them getting outside of themselves, about them tapping into this bigger source, about them opening up?
Right. I think the starting point is going to be that the parent has a chance for someone to know them first. And this is the hard part about adoptive parenting, is that no one really gets you as a parent. You're going to be friends with, the parents in your neighborhood or your child's school, or your place of religion. And those parents are going to be raising kids who are biological kids, and for the most part aren't having the deep challenges that you are. I can remember sitting at a mom's night out one time, and my kids, I had left the home to get out for the evening. Just getting out of the house was like a major accomplishment, right? And I'm sitting there, and all the other moms are talking about, their toddlers having a tantrum and this and that. And I was like, well, how long does that tantrum last? And they're like, oh, I don't know, like 2 or 3 minutes. And I'm like, 2 or 3 minutes? My kids are having 2 or 3 hour tantrums. And so there's this big disconnect. And so what I needed first was someone to understand me, and I wasn't finding it in my own circle of friends. And so I think it did take some professional help, or like an adoption support group, where you're going to be able to be around other parents and go, oh yeah, I know those 2 or 3 hour tantrums. I've gotten a 4 hour one. Like, they can even one up you. And so having the validation that you really aren't crazy, that you really are not, you're not being the drama mama, or, you're not in that making this stuff up. And so first is that the parent has to be validated. Someone has to get into their shoes first. And once they have that validation and the acknowledgement, and the parent can really acknowledge, okay, this is really hard, and I am going through a hard time. Not to stay there. I think sometimes we get scared to let people go into their darkness because we're scared they're going to get stuck there. But to allow that darkness to come up, to be seen, to be heard, to be validated. And then once the parent is able to do that, and that might mean some crying, that might mean some journaling, that might mean emoting. I think, one of the things, I was in pretty good shape during this time because I'd go to the gym and just lift weights. And it was just like getting that energy out. And so whatever that piece is for you, it's going to be different for all of us, but to really dissipate all that pent up energy. And then to make the crossover, then they can be ready to go, okay, now I have the space, the emotional space to start to see it from my child's perspective, rather than to say, well, you should be grateful for this. I cooked you dinner, you should be happy, versus I understand why it's really hard for you to come to the table and make that transition. And so getting out of our perspective, I believe, just in summary, it means that someone's got to see us. We got to see ourselves first and then be able to make that crossover. Because you're just not going to have the energy. You're not going to have the emotional space. If you are a parent and you're in survival mode, and that's with all of us, if anyone is sort of in that survival mode and you're so stressed and so overwhelmed, you don't care about anyone else, like not in a bad way. It's just you don't have the space to do that. And if that's your child, obviously a parent, you got to care about your child. So you have to get the work done yourself. And I just encourage anyone that might be listening, if they're that parent that doesn't feel like they have it in them, you can feel very, very isolated. One of the things about adoptive parenting is that parents feel incredibly isolated. So it does take some courage to reach out, and you're going to reach out and people are going to say, oh no, I can't be that bad. Or, oh, wow, this is so wonderful what you're doing for your kids. And you're like, I'm not there yet. I need someone to connect with me. So keep looking, keep searching. You will find that person or that group that is able to hold that space for you. That's imperative. It is imperative. And then to be able to make that stretch over into another person's perspective. And I tell you, when you're able to do that as a parent, that's when things can really change. When you are able to let go of your anger, your resentment, your just your frustration even, and you can start to see it from your child's perspective, it starts making sense. And you go, okay, I get it. Your level of patience comes back. Your ability to hold that love for them that someone held for you can be reciprocated back then for your child. And you're going to have a much better experience. I'm not going to say your kids will magically be obedient, but you're just not going to feel that level of resistance and pain anymore. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Was there a moment when you connected with another a group of adoptive parents and you realized that, look, this is the trauma, this isn't my parenting?
I was not able to find that group. I ended up going into therapy and just once a week, just downloading with my therapist. And he really wasn't an adoption therapist, but he really validated me. And it was like I was holding on, like to get through the week, I was holding on for that 1 hour that I could talk to someone and tell them what was going on. And for them to go, yeah, that really is bad, and to dive in my own childhood and go, wow, how did you come out so, so stable out of that childhood? And so, and, part of me, there's always that negative voice in your head. It's like, oh, well, they're just paid to tell you that. But I got rid of that. And he was genuine. He was authentic. He listened. And that was the piece that I could go back home and go, okay, I can make it another week. I can do this.
Yeah. The inner voice in our head. We've all got one, right?
Oh yeah. They're not very pleasant, are they?
They're not very pleasant. and I think there's a lot of unpleasantness in trying to drown that voice out. So resisting it.
Yeah.
Resisting it is tough. Trying to stop it is tough because it's almost as if we're fighting the voice in our head prolongs the battle.
Yes.
So I had an insight about this while swimming the other week, right? And I don't know if I shared it with anybody. So on the podcast or not. But for me, it was a great analogy. So I'm quite a strong swimmer, and there's less strong swimmers in the pool, right? And they're sometimes clogging it up, right? So there's some impatience going on, right?
Right.
Okay, right. So I'm swimming along, and my body's just doing what it does, right? My body's not bothered. My body's on autopilot. Like, we don't think about walking, do we? We don't think about walking. We don't think, oh, I'm going to put this one foot in front of another. And so the swimming, the body's doing its own thing. The voice in my head's going ape about these slow swimmers, right? And then there's another part of me that is the lifeguard. In the chair, like in the stool that so that they can see the whole of the swimming pool, and another part of me is the lifeguard in the chair, which is like, can't really see a problem here. So for me is the metaphor for perspective, because with the bigger picture,
yes,
me and the lifeguard, I can look down. The other way that I, if I'm operating at the same level as the voice in my head, I'm telling the voice in my head to shut up and saying, why are you complaining? Why are you complaining about this other slow swimmer? There's other people that are faster than you. You shouldn't be complaining about that. And then all the kind of like the shoulding happens, right? And the resistance just gets bigger. Whereas the insight comes from a higher perspective of being the lifeguard, and that's what insight is. When we are stuck with the problem, and we put it on the back burner, and then we've got the solution to it. Whilst we're fighting for a solution, it doesn't come to it.
And that is what love is to me. Love is that broader perspective. Love sees the solutions. Love sees the divine in everyone. Love sees that you're going to be okay. And that little voice in your head, when you're behind that slow swimmer, that's what fear is. Fear creates more fear, creates the frustration, creates the conversation that's just combative. And so fear only sees problems. So that's, I think, goes back to why I say this is a spiritual experience, because you have to rise above that and see, yes, you acknowledge it, you see it, but you also see it from a place of love, from the lens of love, and that it's all okay.
Yeah. So obviously I gave you a swimming metaphor, right? Because I haven't got an adoptive parent story about that. Can you give us does that prompt anything else
Sure,
something that's perhaps more relevant to the listeners who are adoptive parents, right?
Yeah,
they're not all swimmers, right? Who wants to hear about Simon swimming? But sometimes it's easier to hear
No, I love it. I love it. So I'll give you an example, and this has to do with my own kids. And first, I will say this. I went to my children one day when we were pretty much out of the thick of, we're never out of the thick of it. We're still growing, but the really hard stuff was over. And I said, would it be okay if I gave some examples of our own family when I do trainings or podcasts? And my son goes, well, of course, Mom. We don't want you acting like other parents. What do you say? He said, of course, Mom, we don't want other parents acting like you did. I couldn't even say it right. And what he really said was this, what his intention was, of course, Mom, we don't want other families struggling like we did. And so they've given me permission to give a few stories, and I told him nothing too personal. But so my son, I will say he has definitely outwardly struggled more than my daughter. And both my kids, by the way, are 28 years old. He was adopted at 2.5 years old from an orphanage in Russia and had never connected with his birth mother, had been placed in the adoption the minute he was born. So that connection never happened. And so obviously, there was just a lot of just deep childhood pain. And so growing up, he got into some trouble. He got into, some situations. I don't want to get all the details, but I'm sitting in court one day and I'm like, I can be that lifeguard that says, okay, we're going to make our way through this. He's going to learn his lesson. This is just the life journey that he's chosen, and he's going to come out of this beautifully. Or I could sit there as you, the swimmer, behind the slow one and go, why am I even sitting here? I give this kid everything. Why is he throwing it all the way? Why is he throwing his life away? Why is he making these bad choices? What have I done wrong? What if starting to blame me? And so I had a choice. How am I going to sit there? And where am I going to hold my thought process? Where am I going to hold my energy? And, I'm not going to say I was perfect at it, but there were days that I sunk down deep, or there were days I would rise above it. And you know what? I'll tell you, I had a beautiful conversation with my son today. He's got 2 degrees actually. Was able to graduate college. He has a full-time job, making pretty decent money from where he was. He's now living in a situation that's much better than when he was even 6 months ago. Like he's shifting, he's finding his way. I couldn't always see that, but that's how you have to do it. You have to live your life in that place. And, whether you're talking about adoption or just the challenges of any family or business life or whatever, it's a great place to be, rising above and being in that lifeguard chair rather than and what can I say, in the hell of it all. There's no other way sometimes to say it.
Yeah. Yeah. You use the word choice there somewhere in that. Yeah. I guess most of the time, most people aren't choosing, right? We're not.
I don't believe so. I think they're so driven by, you talk about those inner voices. I know that's something you've had to overcome, that said, I'm sure, so many adopted children, and correct me if I'm wrong, you had that direct experience, but they don't believe they're lovable. They don't believe they're worthy, that they are capable, that they're smart, that they're even allowed to be on this planet. Like my son at 5 years old basically told me that he didn't deserve to be on this planet. And so if you're 5 years old and you don't deserve to be on this planet in your mind, well, then you are going to be disruptive. You are not, when someone gives you a present, you're going to tear it up because you don't feel like that you are even deserving of that. And so then the adult says, well, look how rude they are. Look how horrible. They don't appreciate anything. But the child says, look, I am not capable. I am not worthy. I don't even deserve to be here. So don't even give me this thing that reminds me of that. I'm going to tear it up. And so I don't believe in the idea of choices when kids are that dysregulated, when they are in such a zone of, it's a choice, but it's a choice made out of the belief system that is incredibly negative. It's made out of a disruptive identity. I think self-identity is something we have to talk about for our children, because their identity that they sort of find themselves in is pretty negative. And so you're going to be living and making choices from that. It's not about, it's showing them how to be respectful and how to write a thank you note and how to, do these things that we do as typical parents. You got to get deeper than that. This is way deeper. This is being driven from a heart that has a hole in it. This is driven from a child that feels like that their mother gave up on them, that they were a bad baby. And in the adoption world, we tell children, no, I chose you. No. What about the fact that if you're the adoptee, that your mother and your father or whoever gave up on you from their perspective? Yes. Help me to know your experience a little bit more on that level.
Yeah. So I've had 30 seconds in 55 years of intense anger and fear towards my birth mother, right? 30 seconds. As opposed to probably 30 years of concern about business, right? But those 30 seconds were really, really tough.
Right.
Really, really tough. And there's a difference between, big difference between being loved and feeling lovable.
Yes, exactly.
So feeling lovable is about our identity. And identity is my favorite subject. Identity is my favorite subject. Identity is my favorite subject. Because what most people think is identity is actually their ego. A lot of people, this is supposed to be your expertise here, really, not mine. On this, I'll talk about it very briefly, and I've done this before. People might have heard me doing this, right? So think of a clenched fist, listeners, because you can't see what I'm doing on the video call, the Zoom call that I'm doing with Heather. Think of a clenched fist, and the fist is clenched because this is a symbol of anger, and the anger is a symptom of the trauma. That's the clenched fist. As I open my clenched fist, which I'm doing for Heather here, I'm revealing a glass diamond. And that diamond is a metaphor for who we are. So the trauma is the fist, the diamond is our true identity. And that's my metaphor for it. Because the reason that I'm hopeful about adoption is that we are not our trauma. We are not our trauma. So our identity, trauma is something we feel, not something we are. Trauma is something we feel, not something that we are. So all my focus is on helping people see the diamond within them. So if I'm working with an adoptive group of adoptive parents, I want them to see the diamond within them, the diamond that they are, because the more clearly they can see it within themselves, the better able they're going to be to point it out to their kids, and the better able they are to point at it with their kids, the more likely their kids are going to see it. Because identity, it trumps everything. I'm totally bang on with you. We look at behavior, and we go upstream of behavior to feelings. Then we go from upstream of feelings to the thoughts that drive those feelings. And then from thoughts, we go to the biggest thought of all, which is our self-identity. So what's wounded in the primal wound? Our ego. Why are you so positive, Simon? Well, because my ego isn't who I am.
Right, exactly. It's the small self. You have to see the bigger self.
Yeah.
And you know what, that diamond, here's where my work has really come in, and that I had to learn, is how do you parent a child then that is showing all that anger? The fist is in front of you. And how do you parent them so that you aren't creating more anger and you're allowing them to eventually let go of that fist? Because that fist is nothing but protection. That is their fear. That is to say, I don't ever want to be vulnerable. They're trying to protect that diamond inside. But by doing that, they're cutting themselves off from relationship and they're isolating themselves. So how do you get them to open up and allow that diamond to shine through? And that's where the parenting comes through. And that's where my first book, which is called Beyond Consequences, Logic and Control. It's beyond the consequences. If you keep getting consequences after consequences and, punishment after punishment after punishment without ever addressing the child's heart, then you're going to create a bigger fist and a bigger fist and a bigger fist. And so the challenge then as a parent is, how do you still, of course, hold children accountable, hold boundaries, which they need to learn, but to do it in a loving way rather than a fear-based way. And that is what the essence of my work is, to build relationship with children. And when they do act out, instead of doing a timeout, you send them away to think about what they've done. That's not what happens. What they think about is how bad they are. Oh, I really am bad. I really am not lovable. She says she loves me, but she put me in timeout. Well, that just proves, talk is cheap. So that just proves I am not lovable. So instead of doing a timeout, you do a time in. And so a time in is that you connect and you give that child attention, which in our traditional world says, well, now you're giving them attention for the bad behavior. No, you're giving them attention for that diamond that is inside. And you're giving them the security of relationship to eventually allow that fist to let go, just a little strength at a time. And so it takes a very different way of parenting, which I think any child needs to be parented out of love, not out of fear. For kids that don't have that kind of identity growing up, the traditional parenting does work because they still feel like they're okay. They still know that they're lovable. So some of these, which I say are just fear-based parenting techniques, not what I would advise, they still work because that child has that diamond. They know that diamond. They let the world see that diamond. And so we have to parent definitely for our children in a much different way to make sure that we're not building more resistance and more of that tightening of the fist.
Yeah. So it's science, it seems to me, right? Yeah. And I'm asking you a question. Is it, so it's science and then art? Is it science and then art? Because there's an art to what you're talking about.
Oh, an art. Yes. It is an art. In fact, that's my third parenting book talks about the science and the art of parenting. Like to me, the analogy I like to use is a dance, is that at first when you interact with a child, let's say they're being resistant, they're like, no, I'm not setting the table, F you, or, go to wherever. And at that moment, we try to get that child, we start to try to lead the dance. Well, don't you use that language with me. And right, we pull them into our world. We start wanting to be the ones that lead. It's the opposite. You have to let them lead first in relationship and say, wow, I see you're really upset right now. What's going on? Right? You don't correct the behavior in the moment. You're going to have a chance later to correct the behavior. But in that moment, if you understand the brain, and that's the science, to understand that if you are correcting the behavior, adding more fear, which is by adding more punishment or threatening consequences or threatening to take away something, that child is going to go deeper and deeper and deeper into that lower part of the brain. And so the art then is to stay in relationship, even though they've done something wrong, but to be in relationship, connect with them, support them in their struggle, don't agree with it, but to support them that they are struggling, that they want to communicate something, be open to what they need to communicate. And if they say, well, you're not my real mom, you can't tell me what to do. That's the classic one. You say, you're right, I'm not. Right? When I told my son, you're right, I'm not your real mom. Listen, I know I'm his mom. I'm his adoptive mom, but I know he also has another mom. There's space for two moms. I know there is. And so when he says that or said that, I was like, yeah, you're right. Like, I'm just going to validate you right in this moment. And it just drops his ability to fight. And so then when they do calm down, that's when you teach the lesson to say, listen, in our house, we're respectful to one another. I know you don't want to empty the dishwasher or make your bed or whatever the chore is, but listen, how about I do it with you? I'll join you. And that way we're together. And so there is that dance, like you let them lead, but then you take back the reins and then you lead once they are calm, once they are rational, once they can make that appropriate choice, as we said, the choice that is more about living in a family and getting along and all those things, that they're kind of out of that raw, deep state that says they're not lovable. They can get out of that, but they need your help to get out of that. They can't do it on their own.
So I'm just conscious of time there. What's the question that I've not asked that you'd like to share something on?
I guess the question that I get asked a lot from adoptive parents is, but how do I know? How do I know we're going to be okay? And, I would love to say, okay, well, this is how you know. This is, you have this diagnosis, or this is what you do, and you go to this school, and you go to that school, or you add in this intervention or that medication. Like, you just have to know that every single child has potential for healing. We are on this planet for our own growth. We are on this planet to learn what love looks like. And every child's journey is going to be a little bit different. But I do believe that every single child has the potential for getting better. And by that, I mean by healing. And yeah, there are some children that I've worked with in really, really tough situations where there might be fetal alcohol, or there's a diagnosis that definitely impacts their brain. And so they may not be the same as your neighbor who's getting ready to send their child off to Harvard. You know, my very best friend growing up, and she was my best friend as a young mother. You know, her child was literally, she went off to Harvard, you know, and I knew that wasn't going to be my child's story. And if I could get my child through kindergarten, I was happy. You know, like, you just have to set the bar for where your child is, not where the rest of the world is. And for that child, yes, there's always movement ahead. There's always growth forward. And that's why I'll end this with saying that love always prevails, because there's always room for love. But don't let yourself get in a place of comparison. Don't let yourself get in a place where your expectations are going to be different. This is your child's journey. And the more that you allow that child to be who they need to be, and to find how to get rid of those negative voices, and to find their capacity for owning their own stuff and being able to take responsibility, they'll be able to do that. It's just going to look different. Love looks different for many kids and for many parents.
Yeah. Fantastic stuff. The how do I know question is not one I've heard, actually. So that's fascinating. How do you know? That sounds like a left brain question, and there's no peace in that left brain stuff.
No. And I think it is from the heart. Like, how do I know my kid? Like, for a parent, how do I know? How do I know that what I'm doing is the best for my child? How do I know that my child then is, that I'm not going to mess up, that I'm going to make sure that I've given my child everything that they need? And just by every single day, by unconditionally loving and finding the resources and holding strong on this journey, then you know you've done everything. And 30 years from now, 60 years from now, when you're on your deathbed, to look back and say, yes, I know, yeah, I did everything I could. And that's what love looks like.
Yeah. And I guess I was listening to a podcast the other week about a guy saying similar sorts of things. He's saying, like, he was talking about his brain being like a bouncer, right? So it has a doorman, like in the States. So
same thing, yeah.
He was saying that he had to know scientifically, he had to have the proof before he was going to believe something, right? Mm-hmm. So the proof is, how do you know? How do we know? The proof is in all the other adopted kids who have gone before them and who it's worked out for. There's some proof. There's some proof there. And the other proof is that they're in the right place. They're listening. They've got to the end of this hour-long podcast. They are prioritizing. They're prioritizing their family's well-being to make this happen. And if you want to take the next steps, listeners, in the show notes, as always, there are links to the guests' links to the guest website and socials, and on that website you will see the proof that things do work out if we do the work. And you're already doing the work, listeners, because you're listening to this.
Right. And I want to add to that, because I think, again, that negative voice in the head, I hear parents say, well, I know adoptive kids that ended up in jail. And yeah, there's things that happen, like, but is that their journey? Is that where they're going to find themselves? Like, what happens after that? Like, don't always just go to the negative. Like, the negative doesn't mean that that's the dead end. There are other things that people can learn and grow. And again, I just encourage every parent to know that the outcome of your kids is called free will, is up to them. But as long as you give everything that you have to give without expecting anything in return, in fact, that allows children to find their way better. If you have an expectation of how they need to be and how they need to act and who they need to be, and that puts more pressure on them. And so by allowing your children to have their own story, and sometimes, I'll just say, people have asked me how my son is. I'm like, well, he's on his own journey. And right now he's in a good place. He might not be in 6 months. I don't know, but I know that I'm here in the way that he needs me. That's what parenting is all about.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, listeners. Thank you too, of course, Heather. Thank you for.
All right. Well, thank you for having me, Simon.
Okay. Thanks, listeners, and we'll speak to you very soon. Bye-bye.